In my family, when women spoke against men, they got one warning before having their tongues burned off with hot metal, while their own mothers held them down. I watched them do it to my sister when she asked her husband why he came home at 3 a.m., smelling like another woman. During COVID lockdown, I secretly taught myself ventriloquism from YouTube and started training other girls to throw their voices so I can speak without moving our lips. My sister screams stopped after 4 seconds. That's how long it takes for hot metal to destroy the nerves in a human tongue. She was 19 and had asked her husband why he came home at 3 a.m., smelling like another woman. They made us younger girls watch from the doorway, a reminder of our future if we forgot our place. Husband held her shoulders while she thrashed, whispering, "This is for your own good," like he was doing her a favor. Growing up, we called it purification. When a woman spoke against any man in our family, father, brother, husband, even teenage sons, she got one warning the second time. They held her down in the kitchen, while her own mother heated the iron rod until it glowed orange. The women who'd been purified couldn't scream anymore. They couldn't taste, most couldn't swallow solid food. But they were considered blessed, finally freed from the sin of defiance. My aunt had the procedure done 3 times. By the end, there wasn't enough tongue left to burn. She communicated by tapping on walls. 2 taps for yes, 3 for no. At family dinners, she'd sit with her bowl of lukewarm broth, tears streaming down her face whenever she watched us eat. She'd lost 90 pounds in 2 years. Her collarbones looked like they might slice through her skin. When she hugged me, I could feel every rib. I was 15 when I watched them do it to my sister. My mother held her head, smoothing her hair, like she used to when we were children. My grandmother heated the rod with practice, efficiency. She'd done this to her own daughters decades ago. My father quoted scripture about feminine evil, while the smell of burning flesh filled our kitchen. That night, I threw up everything I'd ever eaten and swore I'd find a way out. The breakthrough came during COVID. Everyone was wearing masks. I started teaching myself ventriloquism from YouTube videos. I'd practice in the bathroom with the water running, keeping my lips perfectly still while throwing my voice. I recorded myself obsessively analyzing every micro movement. Within 6 months, I could have full conversations without moving my mouth. I could make my voice sound like it came from across the room, from inside closets, from behind closed doors. Started a sewing circle for unmarried girls. Every Sunday, after lunch, 8 of us would gather in my basement to learn the craft. What we really did was practice. I taught them ventriloquism, sign language, and written communication codes. We developed our own system, writing messages on each other's palms during family gatherings, using finger positions that looked like prayer gestures. A thumb pressed twice meant danger. A pinky curl meant meet tonight. The older women noticed something strange. Their daughters were becoming too quiet, too compliant. It's unnatural. My aunt tapped on the dinner table, but the men were pleased. Finally, a generation of women who knew their place. We got bolder. I stole medical supplies from my job at the clinic. Gel, antibiotics, burn cream. I couldn't stop the burnings, but I could prepare. Every girl in our group carried a hidden kit, sewn into their dress linings. We practiced treating burns on raw chicken skin. If it happened to them, at least they'd survive the infection. That called 1 in 3 women who underwent purification. Everything unraveled at my cousin's wedding. Her new husband was hammered, groping her 14-year-old sister in full view. The girl started to protest, then caught herself remembering the consequence. But I watched her hands moving in our code. "He's touching me. Help." I threw my voice, made it sound like it came from behind the husband. "Get your hands off her, you sick fuck." The room erupted. Men spun around, searching for the woman who dared speak. Husband grabbed his new bride, demanding she confessed. When she opened her mouth, only silence came out. She'd been purified years ago. I did it again and again. Different locations, different voices. "She's a child. Everyone can see what you're doing. Your own wife is watching." The men went into a frenzy. They lined up, every woman under 30, checking our mouths, making us try to speak. But we all stayed silent. Some because they had to, others because we trained for this moment. Then my 12-year-old cousin broke the pressure. The fear. She started signing frantically, then caught herself and switched to speaking. "It's Anna. She taught us. She's been teaching us all too." They grabbed me before I could run, held me down right there at the wedding reception, while my mother begged them to wait, to let or heat the rod properly. But they were beyond ritual now. My uncle used a lighter from his pocket, heating a butter knife while 200 wedding guests watched. The pain was unlike anything I'd ever imagined. Not just the burning, though. That was excruciating. But the betrayal. My own family, the people who were supposed to protect me, holding me down. While my uncle pressed the heated metal against my tongue, I thrashed against their grip. But there were too many hands. My father's on my shoulders, my brother's on my arms, my mother trying to hold my head steady, while tears streamed down her face. The smell hit me first, accurate and wrong, like meat left too long on a grill. Then came the sizzling sound, and finally, mercifully, the nerves died and took the worst of the pain with them. My uncle pulled the knife away after what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Not enough to do permanent damage. He'd been too hasty, too angry, but enough to leave me gasping, choking on my own saliva mixed with blood. They released me, and I crumpled to the floor. Around me, the wedding guests stood frozen. Some of the older women nodded approvingly, while others looked away. The younger girls, my students, kept their faces carefully blank. But I saw their hands moving in our code. Danger. Run. Hide. My mother knelt beside me, pressing a cloth to my mouth. Her hands shook as she whispered apologies I couldn't respond to. My tongue felt thick and foreign, swollen to twice its normal size. When I tried to speak, only a wet, gurgling sound emerged. My uncle grabbed my hair, forcing me to look at him. His face was red with rage and alcohol. He demanded I reveal everything about our group, our meetings, our plans. Couldn't have answered even if I wanted to. My mouth wouldn't work properly, and the pain made thinking impossible. That's when I noticed something strange. My 12-year-old cousin, who'd exposed me, was signing frantically to one of the other girls. Not our code, but actual sign language, which she wasn't supposed to know. The other girls signed back, their fingers flying in conversation. Been practicing without me? My uncle noticed too. He released my hair and stalked toward them. The girls immediately stopped. But it was too late. He'd seen enough. His eyes swept across the room, taking in all the young women, all my students. I could see him piecing it together. The quiet compliance, the strange hand gestures during family gatherings, the way none of them had spoken during his interrogation. He ordered all the men to gather. The unmarried girls in the center of the room. The band had long since stopped playing, and the wedding feast sat forgotten on tables. This was no longer a celebration, but an inquisition. One by one, they tested each girl, made them speak, checked their tongues for signs of previous burning, watched for any hand movements. Most stayed silent, terrified. But 3 more broke under the pressure. They'd only been with us for a few months. Hadn't built up the mental fortitude yet. They confessed everything. The basement meetings, the ventriloquism lessons, the medical supplies, the communication codes. They even revealed where I'd hidden the practice materials. The notebooks full of hand signals. The medical kits sewn into dress linings. My uncle's rage grew with each revelation. This wasn't just defiance. It was organized rebellion. 8 girls who'd learned to subvert the natural order, to communicate in secret, to prepare for resistance. In his mind, I'd corrupted an entire generation. He ordered the men to search us all. They found the medical kits exactly where the girls had said they'd be. Numbing gel, antibiotics, burn cream, all stolen from the clinic where I worked. Evidence of premeditation. of planning for the very punishment meant to silence us. My grandmother stepped forward then. At 82, she was the oldest woman in our family, had overseen more purifications than anyone. She examined the medical supplies with interest, running her fingers over the antibiotics. Then she looked at me with something I couldn't quite identify. Respect, understanding, or just disappointment that I've been caught. She spoke to my uncle in the old language, words I only partially understood. Something about tradition, about proper procedures, about the old ways. He argued back, but she held firm. Whatever she said, it made him pause. They dragged me to my feet. My legs barely held me, and I tasted copper with every swallow. My grandmother announced that this required a family council. All the elders would need to be consulted. This went beyond simple defiance. It was systematic corruption that threatened their entire way of life. They locked us in the church basement, all 8 of us, plus the 3 younger girls who'd been caught, signing. No windows, 1 door. Nothing but concrete walls and old wooden pews. They said they'd decide our fate in the morning. As soon as the door locked, the other girls surrounded me. They checked my mouth, applied what little numbing gel they managed to hide, gave me water to rinse with. Their hands moved constantly in our code, updating me on what had happened. While I was semi-conscious, 2 of the girls' fathers had already announced they'd move up their daughters' wedding dates. Better to marry them off quickly before they could cause more trouble. I'm trying to understand how Anna learned to throw her voice so perfectly that grown men couldn't figure out where it came from. That must have taken incredible practice. The way she taught the other girls sign language and secret codes is really clever. Another girl's brother had threatened to perform the purification himself if the elders took too long to decide. But something else was happening too. The 3 girls who'd broken under pressure were teaching the others the sign language they'd learned in secret. Apparently, they'd found additional resources online, had been practicing beyond what I'd taught them. They were adapting, evolving, continuing the resistance. Even as everything fell apart, I tried to speak, to warn them too, but my tongue wouldn't cooperate. The swelling made everything thick and clumsy. So I used our code instead, my fingers flying, as I communicated what I'd overheard from my grandmother. The old ways, the proper procedures. There might be a loophole in our family's tradition. Purification could only be performed by the eldest woman in the household, using the sacred iron passed down through generations. What my uncle had done in public with a butter knife in anger violated every rule. My grandmother knew this. That's why she'd intervened. But it also meant that come morning, they do it properly. All of us, one by one, with the full ritual. Unless we found another way. The youngest girl, barely 13, raised her hand. She'd been practicing something she wanted to show us. She stood in the corner of the room and began to speak. But her lips didn't move. The voice seemed to come from the door, from the walls, from everywhere at once. She'd mastered ventriloquism better than I ever had. That's when I realized we had one advantage they didn't know about. They thought they'd caught all of us. But our network was larger than the 8 in this room. We'd and teaching others in secret. Girls from neighboring families, cousins who visited during holidays. The knowledge had spread beyond their ability to contain it. I motioned for the girls to gather close. Using our code, I outlined a plan. It was dangerous, possibly deadly, but it was better than waiting for morning. Better than accepting our fate. We spent the night preparing. Those who could still speak practiced their ventriloquism, throwing their voices to different corners of the room. Others refined their sign language, creating new signals for the specific situation we faced. I worked with the medical supplies we had left, teaching them how to treat severe burns, how to recognize infection, how to keep airways clear if the swelling came too severe. As dawn approached, we heard footsteps above us. Multiple sets, heavy and purposeful. The family council had reached their decision. The door opened, and my uncle stood there with 6 other men. Behind them, I glimpsed my grandmother carrying the ancient iron, already heating in its portable brazier. They built a proper platform in the church sanctuary, wooden restraints for our arms and legs, head brace to keep us still. Everything needed for assembly line efficiency. They planned to do all 11 of us in one morning. Restore order in a single, devastating act. My grandmother approached me first. As the ringleader, I'd receive the full punishment. Not the quick, angry burning my uncle had given me, but the slow, methodical destruction that would leave nothing functional behind. She looked into my eyes as she tested the iron's heat, and I saw something there I hadn't expected. Sorrow. She knew exactly what she was about to do, had done it to her own daughters. And yet some part of her grieved. They forced me onto the platform, securing the restraints. The other girls were lined up to watch, to see what happened to those who defied the natural order. My mother stood with them, her face a mask of anguish. I begged them to spare me, to give me one more chance. But the council had been unanimous. The iron glowed orange in the morning light, streaming through the church windows. My grandmother lifted it, steady, despite her age, and brought it toward my face. This was it, the moment that would silence me forever. But we were ready. The youngest girl's voice erupted from behind my grandmother, clear and commanding. The elderly woman spun around, nearly dropping the iron. The voice moved again, this time from the rafters, then from beneath the floorboards. My grandmother's hands trembled as she searched for the source. My uncle rushed forward, grabbing the nearest girl by her shoulders. He shook her violently, but her lips remained sealed. The voice continued, now coming from directly behind him. He released her and grabbed another, then another, growing more frantic with each silent face. The men began arguing among themselves. My father insisted we were possessed by demons. My uncle demanded they proceed immediately. My brother suggested checking the church for hidden speakers. The confusion gave us precious seconds. I caught my grandmother's eye and signed a single word with my bound hands. Mother. Her face went pale. She taught that sign to her own daughter. 40 years ago, before the first purification, before everything changed, the church door burst open. My aunt stood there, the one who'd been purified 3 times. She moved with purpose, her skeletal frame somehow commanding attention. She approached the platform and began tapping on the wooden frame. Not her usual simple communication, but complex patterns that made my grandmother step back. My uncle tried to intervene, but my grandmother raised her hand. She listened to the tapping, her expression shifting from confusion to recognition, to something like fear. Whatever message my aunt conveyed, it carried weight. The men grew restless. They had assembled for a mass purification, not a delay. My father grabbed the iron from my grandmother, declaring he performed the ritual himself. But tradition was sacred. Only the eldest woman could wield the iron. To break that rule would invite catastrophe. My grandmother took back the iron and set it aside. She announced that my aunt had reminded her of an ancient law. Before a mass purification, each accused must face individual trial. The family must hear evidence. Witness testimony determined guilt. It would take days, possibly weeks. My uncle exploded in rage. He accused my grandmother of weakness, of being corrupted by modern ideas. But the other elders supported her. Tradition was tradition. The old ways must be honored. They separated us into different rooms throughout the church complex. I was locked in the vestry, hands still bound, tongue still swollen and useless. Through the thin walls, I heard the others being questioned, their voices sometimes breaking through despite their training. Hours passed. My mouth had stopped bleeding, but the pain remained constant. I tested my voice, managing only rasps and whistles. The partial burning had damaged but not destroyed. With time and practice, I might speak again. If I survived the door, or opened, my mother entered, with water and soft bread. She helped me drink, her hands gentle as she checked my injuries. She told me the trials would begin tomorrow. Each girl would face the council individually. Those found guilty would undergo proper purification. Those deemed innocent would be married immediately, to ensure no future corruption. She also brought news. 3 girls had already recanted, swearing they'd been forced to participate. They named me as the sole instigator, claiming I threatened them. My mother's eyes told me she didn't believe them. But belief didn't matter, only testimony. That night, they moved me to a storage room with a small window. Through it, I could see the other buildings where my students were held. I watched for signs for hand signals in the windows, but saw only darkness. Near dawn, I noticed movement. A figure crept between buildings, too small to be an adult. One of the younger girls had escaped her room. She moved with purpose, not running away, but towards something. I lost sight of her behind the main church. Minutes later, chaos erupted. Men's voices shouted from multiple directions, but not from where they should be. The voices came from empty rooms, from rooftops, from inside walls. The girls who could still speak were using their skills, creating confusion. From their locked rooms, men ran in circles, chasing phantom voices. They checked on each prisoner, finding them all secure, mouths closed, innocent expressions fixed. The voices continued, growing bolder, more mocking. My uncle's authority crumbled as he failed to locate a single source. By morning, exhaustion showed on every male face. They'd spent the night chasing ghosts. The trials would proceed, but doubt had been planted. How could they trust their own ears? How could they know which voice belonged to which girl? My grandmother presided over the first trial. They brought in the youngest girl, the one who'd mastered ventriloquism so completely. She stood before the council, small and defiant. When asked to speak, she remained silent. When ordered to demonstrate her supposed skills, she simply stared. My uncle produced witnesses, men who swore they'd heard her voice during the wedding chaos. But when pressed for details, their stories conflicted. One claimed she'd spoken from the left, another from the right. They couldn't agree on the words, the tone, even the language. The girl's mother testified next. She wept as she described her daughter's recent behavior. Too quiet, too obedient, clearly hiding something. But when asked for specific examples of defiance, she had none. The girl had been perfect, too perfect. Hours of testimony produced no clear evidence. The girl never spoke, never moved her lips, never gave them anything to condemn her. My grandmother seemed troubled. Tradition required proof of guilt, not just suspicion, but how to prove ventriloquism. When the accused wouldn't speak, they tried everything. Threats, promises, even bringing her father to plead. The girl remained stone-faced, communicating nothing. Finally, frustrated, they returned her to confinement and called the next trial. The way these girls are working together to protect each other is really touching, especially when they're facing such terrible danger. I can feel the grandmother's inner struggle between following tradition and knowing deep down this is wrong. That brief moment of sorrow in her eyes speaks volumes about the pain she carries from doing this to her own daughters. Years ago, this pattern repeated throughout the day. Girl after girl stood silent before the council. Some were clearly terrified. There's defiant, but none spoke. The men grew increasingly agitated. Without confessions or demonstrations, they had only circumstantial evidence and conflicting testimonies. By evening, they tried 4 girls with no convictions. My grandmother called a recess. The council would reconvene tomorrow. She announced they needed to reconsider their approach. That night, the voices returned with vengeance. They came from everywhere and nowhere, speaking truths the men didn't want to hear. They recited names and dates, affairs and secrets hidden for decades. The voices knew which uncle visited which widow, which father had debts, which brother had stolen from the family business. Paranoia spread like wildfire. The men turned on each other, accusations flying. How did the girls know these things? Who had told them? Who among the men was secretly supporting this rebellion? I watched from my window as my uncle confronted my father in the courtyard. They shoved each other, voices raised, years of resentment boiling over. Other men joined the argument, taking sides, old alliances crumbling. Inside my room, I worked on my voice. The swelling had reduced enough to attempt sounds. I practiced breathing exercises, tongue movements, anything to regain some control. The partial burning had left scar tissue, but the muscle beneath still functioned. Painful, limited, but functional. The next morning brought new chaos. During the night, someone had released 2 of the girls. They were found at dawn, walking calmly through the church gardens, signing to each other in full view. When captured and questioned, they claimed innocence. They'd woken to find their doors unlocked. Who were they to question such fortune? The men searched for the culprit. They checked every lock, every window, every possible entry point. They found nothing. Suspicion fell on the women, the mothers and grandmothers, who'd seemed supportive of the purifications, just eroded further. My trial came on the 3rd day. They carried me to the sanctuary, my legs too weak from confinement to walk. The council sat in judgment. My grandmother at the center, my uncle to her right. The other girls watched from the gallery, their faces carefully neutral. My grandmother asked me to speak. I opened my mouth, letting them see the damage, the swollen tissue and fresh scars. I made sounds, horrible, croaking noises that might have been words. My uncle smirked, satisfied that I've been effectively silenced. But I've been practicing. Through the pain, I forced out recognizable words. Not clear, not pretty, but understandable. I denied teaching rebellion. I admitted only to hosting sewing circles, innocent gatherings where girls learned traditional crafts. They'd learned other things. It wasn't from me. My uncle produced the medical supplies as evidence. I croaked out an explanation. As a clinic worker, I'd brought home expired supplies rather than waste them. Times were hard. Medicine expensive. Was preparing for emergencies now a crime? The questioning continued for hours. They tried to trap me in contradictions, but I kept my answers simple, consistent. Yes, I learned ventriloquism as a hobby during lockdown. No, I'd never taught it to others. Why would I? What use was such a skill? They brought in the girls who'd confessed, the ones who named me as their teacher. But under my grandmother's careful questioning, their stories began to fall apart. They contradicted each other on dates, locations, specific lessons. One claimed I taught them sign language in the basement. Another said it was in the garden. A third insisted we only met in the kitchen. My grandmother's eyes narrowed. She questioned them separately, catching them in lie after lie. Finally, one broke down completely. She admitted her father had coached her testimony, promised her a lighter punishment if she blamed everything on me. The council erupted in arguments. Some demanded all punishments proceed regardless. Others insisted the trials were compromised. My grandmother maintained order with difficulty. But I saw something shifting in her expression. Doubt, perhaps, or recognition of a game being played beyond her understanding. That night, they locked me back in the storage room. But something had changed. The guard outside my door was my cousin, one of the younger men, barely 18. Through the door, I heard him shifting nervously. Muttering to himself, I tested my voice, managing a whisper that sounded like it came from the hallway. He jumped, looking around frantically. I did it again, this time from above. He backed against my door, terrified. The voice spoke of things only he would know. Private shames and secret desires with. In an hour, he'd fled his post. I heard him telling others he was ill, needed to go home. No one volunteered to replace him. The men were beginning to fear guard duty. Fear being alone with us and our impossible voices. The trials continued, but the council's unity cracked further. Each day, evidence contradicted itself. Witnesses recanted. The girls maintained perfect silence, or spoke only to deny charges. And every night, the voices revealed new secrets, drove new wedges between the men. My aunt played a crucial role. She attended every trial, tapping out observations only my grandmother could fully understand. Whatever communication passed between them, it influenced my grandmother's decisions. More girls were declared innocent, though immediately assigned marriages to prevent future corruption. On the fifth day, disaster struck from within our ranks. One of the older girls, Miriam, broke completely. The pressure, the isolation, the fear of permanent punishment. It shattered her resolve. She confessed everything in detail. The lessons, the codes, network extending beyond our immediate group. But she went further. In her panic, she began inventing things. She claimed, "We planned to poison the men, to burn down the church, to run away and join the outside world." Wild accusations that even my uncle recognized as hysteria. They removed her from the sanctuary, but the damage was done. Truth mixed with lies, making everything questionable. How could they trust any confession now? How could they separate real rebellion from frightened fantasy? That night, I managed to work my door open. Block had been damaged during the guards' frightened flight. I crept through the corridors. Finding two other girls had also discovered their freedom. We signed quickly, planning. We couldn't run. That would confirm guilt and doom the others. Instead, we had to escalate the psychological warfare. Make the men question everything. Turn them against each other completely. I found my way to the kitchen, to the exact spot where they burned my sister years ago. The blood stains remained faint but visible. I knelt there and practiced my voice, pushing through pain to achieve clarity. Not perfect, but good enough. The next morning, they found us back in our rooms. Doors locked from the inside. Impossible, yet undeniable. The men's fear grew. Were we witches? Demon? Or just clever girls who'd learned skills they couldn't understand? My uncle demanded immediate action. Forget trials, forget tradition. Burn them all, and sort out innocence later. But my grandmother refused. The old ways existed for reasons. Abandon them, and chaos would follow. She was right. The men split into factions. Those supporting immediate punishment, against those demanding proper procedure. Those who believed in possession, against those who saw only human. Cleverness theirs turned against brothers. Fathers against sons. During one heated argument, my father struck my uncle. Years of buried resentment exploded into violence. Other men joined the fight, choosing sides based on old grievances rather than current issues. The council meeting devolved into a brawl. My grandmother watched it all, with calculating eyes. When the fighting finally stopped, she made an announcement. The trials were suspended indefinitely. The men had proven themselves incapable of rational judgment. Until unity returned, no punishments would proceed. The girls would remain confined but unharmed. The medical supplies I'd stolen would be used to treat my tongue properly. And most surprisingly, my aunt would serve as guardian and communicator for all the accused. My uncle protested violently, but my grandmother's word was law. She controlled the sacred iron, the ritual tools, the traditional authority. Without her cooperation, no purifications could proceed properly. And improper purifications invited divine wrath. Or so they believed. That night, my aunt visited each of us. Through taps and signs, she conveyed my grandmother's real message. The old woman had been young once. She'd seen her own sisters burned, had participated because she had no choice. But times were changing. The outside world pressed closer every year. She couldn't stop the purifications entirely. That would destroy her authority and invite chaos. But she could delay, complicate, introduce doubt. She could give us time to grow stronger, smarter, more unified. My aunt also brought news from beyond our walls. Other families had heard of our rebellion. Young women in neighboring compounds were asking questions, learning skills, pairing. The knowledge spread like wildfire, impossible to contain. But danger remained. My uncle gathered supporters, men who felt their authority threatened. They met in secret, planning ways to bypass my grandmother's control. They spoke of accidents, of fires that might consume the church, and all evidence of rebellion within it. I used my recovering voice to sow more discord. Whispers in the night, warning loyal men of my uncle's plots. Voices revealing which supporters had their own secrets. own reasons to fear exposure. The conspiracy fractured before it could solidify. The way these girls figured out how to open locks from the inside is making my brain spin with questions. How did they manage to lock themselves back in after exploring? Days passed. Intense stalemate. We remained confined but protected. The men watched each other with suspicion. The women moved carefully, torn between tradition and sympathy for their daughters. Then came unexpected hope. 3 of our girls were claimed by suitors from distant families, men who'd heard of the troubles, but cared only for young, obedient wives. My grandmother approved the marriages immediately, sending the girls away before anyone could object. I knew those girls would carry our knowledge with them. They'd teach others, spread the resistance further. Even if we fell, the movement would continue. My tongue healed slowly. The partial burning left scars, but not total destruction. I learned to speak around the damage. My voice, different but functional. I practiced constantly, preparing for whatever came next. Younger girls showed remarkable resilience. They maintained discipline, communicated in signs, supported each other through fear and isolation. Even Miriam recovered from her breakdown. Signing apologies, we all accepted. My mother visited, when she could, bringing food and news. I spoke carefully, but I heard the conflict in her voice. She'd held my sister down for burning. She'd participated in countless purifications, but watching her own daughter suffer had awakened something. Late one night, she whispered a confession. She'd been the one releasing doors, creating confusion. She couldn't openly rebel, but she could introduce small chaos. Their mothers were doing the same. She hinted tiny rebellions that added up to larger disruption. The stalemate couldn't last forever. Either my grandmother would maintain control and find some face-saving resolution, or my uncle would gather enough support to override tradition. We prepared for both possibilities. I taught the others everything I knew about treating burns. We practiced on each other, memorizing pressure points, infection signs, airway management. If the worst happened, we'd be ready to save who we could. But we also planned for victory. We developed new codes, more subtle and complex. We created cover stories for our skills, innocent explanations that might satisfy suspicious minds. We prepared to hide in plain sight if released. My grandmother called another council meeting. This time, she brought the sacred texts, the ancient laws that governed our traditions. She read passages about justice, about evidence, about the danger of false accusations. She reminded them that God saw all, including the persecution of innocents. He proposed a compromise. The trials had failed to produce clear guilt. The girls had suffered enough through confinement and suspicion. Release them to their families, but under strict supervision. Any future sign of rebellion would bring immediate punishment. But for now, mercy. My uncle objected, but she countered every argument with scripture and tradition. The other elders began nodding, seeing a path forward that preserved their authority, while ending the current crisis. But my uncle made one final demand. The ringleader, meaning me, must face full purification. One sacrifice to appease those who demanded justice. Let the others go, but burn out the source of corruption completely. The room fell silent. My grandmother considered her ancient face unreadable. Around her, the men waited, tension crackling between those who wanted blood and those who wanted peace. She turned to my aunt, who began tapping a long message, complex and layered. My grandmother listened, occasionally nodding. When the tapping stopped, she stood with effort, leaning on her cane. She agreed to my uncle's demand, but with conditions. The purification would happen in 1 week. It would follow every traditional rule, every ancient protocol, and most importantly, I would be allowed to speak in my own defense. First, not in trial, but in testimony before the entire family. My uncle smiled, thinking he'd won a week to prepare. Then public punishment that would restore order. He didn't understand what my grandmother had really given us. Time. An audience. A voice. They returned me to confinement, but with better conditions. Real room with a bed, regular meals, even books. My aunt visited daily, teaching me through taps. What my grandmother expected. Not defiance, but something more subtle. Truth that would plant seeds of doubt in every watching mind. The other girls were released to their families as promised. They returned home subdued, obedient, seemingly broken by their ordeal. But I knew better. They carried our knowledge, our codes, our connections. They would wait, watch. And when the time came, they would be ready. I spent the week preparing my testimony. Not a defense, exactly. That would only anger them. Instead, a story. The truth of what drove us to rebellion. Told in ways that might reach the women forced to watch. The mothers who'd held their daughters down. The grandmothers who'd wielded the iron. The sisters who'd lost their voices. My voice grew stronger each day. Still damaged, still imperfect, but clear enough to be understood. I practiced projecting it, making it carry across large spaces. If I had only one chance to speak, I would make it count. The night before my scheduled purification, my aunt brought unexpected news. My grandmother was ill, possibly dying. The stress of recent events had weakened her ancient body. She might not survive to oversee the ritual. Without her, my uncle would control everything. He'd follow the forms, but ignore the spirit. My testimony would be cut short. My punishment made harsher. The compromise would die with my grandmother. But my aunt tapped out one more message. My grandmother had made provisions, written instructions that must be followed, documents that gave my aunt unprecedented authority as the eldest. Purified woman. If my grandmother died, my aunt would oversee the ritual. The irony was perfect. Woman who lost her tongue 3 times would control the burning of another. My uncle would rage. But tradition was tradition. The eldest woman held the iron, whether she could speak or not. I lay awake that night preparing for either outcome. If my grandmother lived, I had a chance to speak truth to the assembled family. If she died, my aunt would find ways to show mercy within tradition's bounds. Either way, the seeds of change have been planted too deep to uproot. Tomorrow would bring pain, certainly, but also possibility. The other girls were free, spreading our knowledge. The women were awakening to their own power. The men were divided, their absolute authority cracked. The morning arrived with my grandmother still clinging to life. My aunt came to prepare me, her bony fingers adjusting my dress, checking my hair. She tapped instructions on my shoulder. Stand straight, speak clearly. Remember who watches. The entire family gathered in the main hall. Over 300 people from our compound and neighboring ones. Word had spread about the girl who taught rebellion. They came to witness justice. Or perhaps to learn. My uncle had arranged everything for maximum impact. The platform stood in the center, the sacred iron already heating the other. The girls sat with their families, heads bowed, hands folded. But I caught glimpses of their fingers moving in subtle patterns. They were ready. My grandmother entered, supported by 2 women. She looked fragile, but her eyes remained sharp. She took her position at the head of the assembly, my uncle hovering nearby, waiting for her to falter. They brought me forward. My legs shook, but I kept my back straight. The crowd murmured at my appearance. The partial burning had left visible damage. My mouth slightly twisted, scars evident. Some nodded approvingly. Others looked away. My grandmother raised her hand for silence. She explained the proceedings. I would speak my piece, then face judgment. The iron waited, glowing orange in its brazier. My uncle smiled, and anticipating my humiliation, I began with my sister. Described watching her burn at 19 for asking a simple question. The smell, the screams that lasted only seconds before the nerves died. How her husband held her down while calling it love. The women in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Many had witnessed similar scenes. Some had participated. I kept my voice steady, letting the damaged tone carry its own message. I spoke of my aunt, burned 3 times until nothing remained. How she'd weighed 90 pounds at the end, unable to eat solid food. tears streaming as she watched others enjoy meals. The crowd grew quieter. I described the infection rates. 1 in 3 women died after purification, not from the burning itself, but from complications. Swelling that blocked airways, infections that spread to the brain, starvation when swallowing became impossible. My uncle tried to interrupt, but my grandmother silenced him. I had the floor until I finished. Mission demanded it. I moved to the medical supplies. Yes, I'd taken them from the clinic, but not for rebellion. For mercy. To save women like my cousin, who died choking on her own swollen tongue. To prevent the infections that killed my neighbor's daughter. The younger women leaned forward. Their mothers held them back. But I saw recognition in their eyes. They'd all known someone who died after purification. They'd all wondered if it could have been prevented. I admitted teaching ventriloquism, a harmless skill learned during lockdown when everyone wore masks. I demonstrated throwing my voice to different corners of the room. The crowd gasped, looking around frantically. Even knowing the source, they couldn't track it. But I denied teaching rebellion. These girls had learned on their own, adapted to survive in a world that demanded their silence. They found ways to communicate, because humans always do. Suppression breeds creativity. My uncle stepped forward, face red with rage. He demanded I explain the coordination, the codes, the network of resistance. Courage it takes for her to stand before everyone and speak these truths with her damaged voice. I feel so deeply for her in this moment. She's turning her own pain into something powerful by making them face what they've done to their daughters and sisters. How had teenage girls organized so effectively without leadership? I met his eyes directly. Perhaps they'd learned from watching their elders. The men who coordinated businesses, arranged marriages, maintained power structures. If young girls could master such organization, what did that say about their potential? The statement hung in the air. Several men shifted nervously. They'd never considered that their daughters might be studying their methods, learning their strategy. My grandmother asked if I had anything else to say. I turned to address the women directly. Mothers who held their daughters down. Grandmothers who heated the iron. Sisters who watched in silence. I asked them to remember their first time. The fear, the betrayal. The moment they realized their own mothers wouldn't protect them. The weeks of agony that followed. The foods they could never taste again. Then I asked them to count. How many daughters had they lost to infection? How many sisters starved? How many friends died, choking in the night? The numbers were staggering when spoken aloud. My testimony complete, I stood silent. The room erupted in whispers and argued about appropriate punishment. Women exchanged glances I couldn't interpret. The younger girls kept their heads down, but their hands moved constantly. My uncle seized control. He declared my words poison, designed to corrupt. The punishment must be severe enough to cleanse such evil. Full purification, complete removal of the tongue, followed by isolation until I learned submission. But my grandmother spoke. She agreed punishment was necessary, but questioned the method. If purification created martyrs, if it spread rebellion rather than stopping it, was it truly effective? The men reacted with shock. My grandmother had overseen hundreds of purifications. For her to question the practice bordered on heresy. My uncle accused her of senility, of being corrupted by my lies. She stood. Slowly, painfully, but with dignity. She reminded them she burned her own daughters, her sisters, her friends. She upheld tradition for 70 years. But traditions evolved or died. She proposed an alternative. Exile. Send me away, far from the family, where I could spread no more corruption. Let distance accomplish what earning couldn't. The men would maintain authority. The women would keep their daughters. And peace would return. My uncle exploded. Exile rewarded rebellion. It showed weakness. Others would follow my example. Knowing the worst they faced was banishment. The practice of purification would lose its power to terrify. The argument split the room. Older men supported tradition, demanding blood. Younger ones saw wisdom in avoiding martyrdom. Women remained silent, but their eyes spoke volumes. During the chaos, I noticed movement among the girls. Subtle shifts in position. Hands touching briefly. Objects passed between them. They planned something, but I couldn't determine what. My grandmother called for order as eldest. Her word carried weight, but I saw her strength failing. She proposed a vote. Let the family decide collectively. Democracy within tradition. My uncle protested, but others supported the idea. They'd never voted on punishment before. But these were unprecedented times. The very foundations of their world were shaking. They separated by gender and age. Men over 40 in one group, younger men in another. Older women together, younger women apart. The girls of my generation formed their own cluster, whispering despite orders for silence. The vote began with the eldest men. They unanimously chose traditional purification. No surprise there. They built their lives on female silence and wouldn't abandon it now. The younger men split. Some voted for burning, others for exile. They'd grown up in a changing world, had seen the outside pressing in. They understood the danger of creating martyrs. The older women voted for purification. They endured it themselves, forced it on others. To choose differently would invalidate their own suffering, make meaningless their own scars. Then came the younger women, mothers of teenage daughters, wives who'd married after the rules relaxed slightly. They voted overwhelmingly for exile. They'd seen too much death, too much suffering. Finally, the girls of my generation, my students, my network, my hope, they stood together, faces blank, hands still. When asked their vote, they remained silent, not from fear or inability, but from choice. My uncle demanded they speak. They've been tested, proven capable of speech. Their silence was defiance, not disability. But they held firm, communicating nothing. The standoff stretched. Without their votes, the tally was too close to call. My grandmother waited, watching with calculating eyes. She understood what they were doing. Finally, she made a ruling. Violence was a vote in itself. If they wouldn't choose between purification and exile, they were choosing neither. The family was deadlocked. My uncle raged about manipulation, about corruption spreading even now. But my grandmother held firm. The vote had spoken, or failed to speak. Without consensus, tradition offered no clear path. She proposed a final solution. I would choose my own fate, purification or exile. The decision was mine. Let me demonstrate whether I truly believed my own words about choice and agency. The room fell silent. Even my uncle couldn't argue with the elegance of it. Make me complicit in my own punishment. Force me to validate their system by participating in it. I stood before them all. Family and strangers. Supporters and enemies. The iron glowed in its brazier. The door stood open. Exile beyond. Two paths. Both painful. Neither true freedom. But I learned something from my weeks of confinement. From watching the men fracture and the women awaken. Power wasn't just about rules and punishments. It was about belief, about participation. I announced my decision. Neither purification nor exile. I would stay voice intact and continue teaching any who wished to learn. They could burn me, but it would be force, not choice. They could exile me, but it would be kidnap, not acceptance. The room erupted. My uncle grabbed the iron himself, advancing despite tradition. Other men moved to stop him, not from sympathy, but from adherence to rules. Women pulled their daughters back, unsure whether to flee or watch. In the chaos, the girls acted. They'd positioned themselves perfectly, blocking exits, creating barriers. Not through violence, but through simple presence. Bodies in doorways, groups in corridors. Human obstacles to sudden movement. My grandmother collapsed. Stress. The conflict her ancient body couldn't endure. More women rushed to help her. Men shouted orders, and in the confusion, I felt hands on my arms. My aunt and mother flanked me, moving with purpose. Other women joined them, creating a protective circle. They guided me toward a side door. one rarely used. While the men focused on my grandmother, we moved through the compound, gathering others, girls from my network, mothers who voted for exile, even some elderly women who'd remained silent but acted now. Growing group, moving with shared purpose. My uncle's shouts echoed behind us. He'd realized too late what was happening. Not just my escape, but something larger. A fracture in the foundation of their world. We reached the compound's edge. Cars waited, drivers ready. Some of the younger men stood by them, faces carefully neutral. They wouldn't actively help, but wouldn't stop us either. My aunt pressed keys into my hand. An address written on paper. Resources gathered over years, hidden from watching eyes. The network was older than I'd known, built by women who'd lost their voices but not their minds. The other girls climbed into vehicles. They'd return to their families later, claiming confusion, fear, innocence. But they carried more than memories. They had skill, connections, purpose. I looked back at the compound. Smoke rose from the main hall, not from fire, but from the brazier. Knocked over in the chaos. The iron lay cooling on stone floors, its purpose unfulfilled. My mother hugged me briefly.
She would stay.
And you? The slow work of change from within. My aunt tapped a final message on my arm. The address LED to others like us. Women building something new. The car pulled away as my uncle emerged from the building. He stood watching, face twisted with rage. And something else. Fear, perhaps. Understanding that control, once cracked, could never be fully restored.